That's quite a passage. It's got just about something for everyone in it. Of course, we have Jesus talking to a crowd, and maybe not an adoring crowd. There are scribes who have come all the way from Jerusalem to stalk Jesus and test him. We've got Satan, and we've got Beelzebub. And of course, we have confused disciples. Always there are confused disciples in all the stories. Then his family, his mother and his brothers and maybe even sisters show up to try to restrain him, to shut him up because he's getting himself into trouble again. And then he seems to disown his family. Besides the cast of characters, we've got some of the most famous teachings of Jesus. And we've got some of the weirdest teachings. Now, what are we in the 21st century to make of all this Satan talk? And just who is Beelzebub? And then Jesus says, no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Now, how does this work? You have to sneak into the strong man's house, surprise him, and tie him up. Then you have to go outside, enter his house, and plunder the house. And he's talking about us having unforgivable sins and unclean spirits. Not so fun. And of course, there is the famous, a house divided against itself cannot stand, which even Abraham Lincoln picked up and used in a speech in Congress during the Civil War. There's so much stuff packed into these 15 verses that we could spend 15 weeks of sermons exploring all of it. That would take us all the way to Halloween, but don't worry. I'm just going to spend a few minutes here on one of the verses, and then we'll move on. I don't think I could take spending 4 months on this passage, and you probably couldn't either. So, if we were back in the 18th century, I would be preaching about Satan and Beelzebub. Back then in the 18th century, maybe in Jonathan Edwards' sermons, Beelzebub was another name for Satan. And he spent a lot of time talking about Satan. Back in Jesus' day, Beelzebub was the name of a Philistine god, sort of a Philistine Satan, as opposed to a Jewish Satan. Now, maybe in the family-friendly 1950s, I would be preaching about how to treat your family, although in this passage, Jesus really doesn't treat his family too well, it doesn't seem. Now, back in the fall, as the election was approaching, I might have been preaching about the house divided verse, talking about how the country is split into two warring sides, and how we think of the world as them versus us. But today, I'll stay away from Beelzebub and families, and I'll stay away from politics. No, I'd like to take a look at the passage, if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. But not from the perspective of politics or government or even society. I'd like to look at it from a psychological perspective. Now, I think we have to realize that people in the first century, they didn't think like we do today. We, of course, don't know how Jesus perceived how we think, but we can make generalizations about how people in the first century thought and viewed themselves. And the idea of emotional and psychological thought was simply foreign to them. They just didn't think that way. Now, thousands of years ago, maybe 2,000 years before Jesus, people did not really distinguish between God and themselves. God was just sort of a better person, a bigger person, stronger person. People heard God talk to them just as you and I hear each other. We see this in the Old Testament, in Genesis and Exodus. God is walking alongside the Hebrews. God ate and slept with them. God lived in a tent near where they lived. Now, gradually, people began to think of God differently, sort of different than humans. But they still had human-like characteristics, which we see in Psalms. God is a shepherd. God is a warrior hero. And then there were evil forces like Satan. And so when someone was struck with a mental illness, such as schizophrenia, he or she was said to be possessed by an evil being that took over his body. Now, by the first century, people were thinking of God more abstractly, but still in terms not quite like we do. They thought of God as a father, for example, but God isn't their actual father, like they might have thought 1,000 years before. Not like the one from whom they're descended. But they prayed to this father figure. Still, if someone was what we called mentally disturbed, maybe schizophrenic or something, they still believed that he or she was possessed by an evil being, most likely Satan. People figured that when Jesus cured someone of what we would call a mental illness, that he had power over the evil beings, or as the scribes said, by the ruler of demons, he has cast out the demons. In other words, the demons obeyed him because he was the ruler of the demons. But in the first century, people didn't distinguish their emotional and psychological lives from their more concrete daily lives. It was as if a person saw themselves as what they did, how they behaved, which is why Jesus taught ethical behavior. Feelings, good feelings, bad feelings, sad feelings, just simply weren't part of the way they thought. So he taught ethical behavior, not ethical thought. If Jesus had asked the woman at the well, "How are you feeling?" she might have had a little quizzical look and then replied, "Well, I feel with my fingers, just like you do." Jesus talked to people in the first century in terms of the first century, in terms they understood, not in terms of the 21st century. Now, gradually, over the millennium, we evolved physically, but we also evolved mentally and psychologically. It took many hundreds of years after Jesus for us to begin to think introspectively, to become self-aware emotionally and psychologically. Now, Shakespeare might have been the first to articulate this introspective thought in literature. His characters have much more interior thinking than previous characters in the theater.